The following is an edited recording of Perils and Possibilities, an event with Dr. Michael Rubin. It was recorded on Wednesday, the 18th of November, 2020. It is important to note that this was recorded before the election of Joe Biden. The following recording does not necessarily reflect the views of the Alexander Hamilton Society, its members, or the George Washington University. Dr. Rubin, in your view, how much of a threat are Iranian-backed proxies to the United States?
It's a great question, and I wouldn't say the problem is just Iranian-backed proxies. When we think more broadly about American foreign policy, asymmetric warfare is becoming an increasingly difficult problem. I would argue that the threat specifically from Iranian-backed proxies grows as long as we're not willing to hold Iranian officials to account. Certainly in Iraq, the death of Qasem Soleimani, which sort of broke the norms, caused a strategic rethink about the use of so-called proxies or the consequences thereof. And we can debate in the long term what that would mean. I would say that what happened last January 3rd, 2020, with the death of Abu Mahdi Mohandas and Qasem Soleimani was as momentous in US-Iranian relations in our understanding of the strategic calculus as was Operation Praying Mantis back in 1988. The thing that most concerns me, I've done some reporting on Iran's quite sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicle program. And one of the things that Iranians have openly bragged about is not only exporting drones to places like Lebanon, but also exporting the means to manufacture those drones. And so you have a situation where there could in the future be some sort of attack with some strategic ambiguity as to where the return address of that attack comes from. And what worries me is wars in the Middle East aren't caused by water, they're not caused by oil. Fundamentally, they're caused by one side becoming too overconfident. So if, and this also applies to the United States, but in Iran, if the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps circle actually believes its own rhetoric, could they become too overconfident and think that we're not going to react or we're going to be confused or anything like that? That's where it becomes a problem.
And in relation to that threat, what, in your view, would the proper American response be?
Certainly, and this may be controversial, and we can certainly argue about it further in the Q&A. I thought that the U.S. action against Qasem Soleimani was warranted, and it certainly caused some strategic rethink. That also has a high price. I mean, whenever I talk to the Iraqis, and since this is recorded, I can't say exactly who I'm talking to, but up to very high levels, they just don't want Iraq to become the battleground for Iran and the United States to take potshots at each other because they lose out there as well. We're not the only players in the sandbox. I do believe that if we make clear that we're not distracted by proxies and that we are going to look at where the orders come from, that's important. But if I may, John, there's one other issue with regard to Iran that has completely confused US policy over the last couple decades. And that's within the security apparatus, Iranians have a great deal of autonomy. And rather than wait to be ordered from up above to take specific actions, oftentimes what we see with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is that they have complete autonomy to do whatever they need, so long as they haven't been forbidden from doing it. So rather than conceive of someone like the Supreme Leader as just a dictator, the Supreme Leader is like Kim Jong-un in North Korea or like Saddam Hussein was in Iraq. He's really a dictator by veto power, which is a completely different system, which again gives a great deal of plausible deniability. Now, if there's an attack by proxies or by the Revolutionary Guard, let's say rogue elements, oftentimes the natural inclination in the United States is, let's see who's responsible. And that means if you're in the intelligence community, trying to go to the signals intelligence or to the human intelligence to see whether there's a specific order being given. That's seldom, if ever, going to be the case inside Iran. And that also creates the strategic ambiguity, which bolsters Iranian confidence, which makes the trigger point a little bit lower to any sort of conflict. So I'd say if we can be as clear as possible that if we even, that where there's smoke, there's fire, and we're not going to look for absolute proof, that might lead Iranian officials to think twice about trying to rely on proxies.
Some commentators have argued that the recent Abraham Accord between Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel have been successful mainly because those Gulf states view Israel as an increasingly helpful ally in deterring Iranian influence. Do you find any merit in that argument?
Absolutely. The answer is yes, but since academics can't just give a one-word answer, what I would say, the perceived threat of Iran has shifted alliances and changed the strategic background. Where the United States lags behind is in the Pentagon and in Congress with our own calculations of the so-called qualitative military edge, which traditionally, with regard to the Arab-Israeli situation, any arms sales to the region would have to go through a committee that would ensure that Israel maintained a qualitative military edge, since Israel was outnumbered by all the Arab states around it, so that the Arabs wouldn't have both quality and quantity over Israel. Well, the biggest fear in Israel right now isn't a war with Egypt. It's not a war with Jordan. It's not a war with Saudi Arabia. And yet the qualitative military edge seems to be stuck back in that time. The whole issue of the qualitative military edge, or QME, is why the Reagan administration's desire to sell the AWACS, successful desire to sell the AWACS aircraft to Saudi Arabia, were so controversial back in the 1980s. But with this F-35 deal to the United Arab Emirates, the Israelis don't seem to object to it. And fundamentally, the question is, how within the Pentagon and within Congress do we then update the formulas by which we govern who we sell arms to and when, in order to take into account the current situation?
How do you think a Biden administration would handle the Iran situation versus a Trump administration?
The Trump administration embraced this idea of maximum pressure. I'm not as critical of maximum pressure as some other people are, because I see in the past maximum pressure having worked on Iran, specifically with regard to what it would take to release the American hostages, and number two, what it would take to end the Iran-Iraq war. Remember that Ayatollah Khomeini at the time gave a speech back in 1988 likening ending the Iran-Iraq war to drinking from a chalice of poison, but he had no choice if he wanted the revolution to succeed. And that was after, in 1982, refusing to accept a ceasefire, basically because the Revolutionary Guard urged him to continue even after Iraq had been expelled from most of Iranian territory. That said, where I'm critical of the maximum pressure campaign with regard to the Trump administration was two things. Number one, what's the point? What's the purpose? And this is just a basic question. Is the purpose to get the Iranians to the negotiating table, or is the purpose to bring down the regime? I suspect that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wanted to bring down the regime. I suspect that Trump and some of the people around him simply wanted to get them to the Iranians to the negotiating table. But you don't undertake a strategy like that unless you have absolute clarity on what your desired end goal is. I had argued that, I spend a lot of time in Iraq, and the thing is, there were lots of policy arguments why we needed maximum pressure on Saddam Hussein. But then Saddam Hussein's regime fell, and we completely had decimated the Iraqi economy, and now Iraq is our friend. So I would argue whether there's a way to go after Iran with a scalpel rather than with an axe, because you don't want to push the Iranian economy beyond the point of no return. I thought we could have done much more with soft power as well. For example, I don't think you're going to have any regime change in Iran until the Revolutionary Guard fractures. And again, one of our intelligence holes are the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard. But when I lived in Iran, and I see there's a lot of Iranians or Iranian Americans on the call, they used to call me Pasari Shaitani Bozorg. But when I lived in Iran, one of the things I saw when I was especially in like Western areas of Tehran, where you have a lot of Pastaran families, was that the Pastaran, there was a lot of grievance about how the state ignored them, how the state, especially those who had been injured during the Iran-Iraq war. So why not send one of our hospital ships to Dubai and tell the Revolutionary Guard veterans that any Revolutionary Guard veteran can have free medical care. Either they will be prevented from going, at which point it would cause dissension, or they will be able to come and get free medical care, at which point it breaks down. It's an intelligence or propaganda coup. And one of the interesting things, by the way, and I'll get into Biden in a second, but one of the interesting things with the Iran dispute is I spent time in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and there's visceral hatred towards the other side. And I spend time in Pakistan and India, and there's visceral hatred with regard to the Kashmir conflict. When it comes to the Iran-US dispute, it's a diplomatic dispute, it's a political dispute, but I don't see visceral hatred on the part of most Americans or Iranians with regard to the other side, and that is a reason for some sort of optimism. With regard to Trump had the maximum pressure. Biden will want to relieve sanctions and renegotiate. You're not going to be able to simply rejoin the Iran nuclear deal because, like I said, unlike previous non-proliferation regimes, it had sunset clauses attached. It will expire. And that timeline has moved on. The Iranians aren't simply going to accept going back to the status quo ante, which means renegotiations. Then the question before the Biden administration is, do you relieve pressure as a precondition to get people to the table? Or do you only relieve pressure and once you get concessions from Iran with regard to some of the other issues that might need to be discussed, such as the ballistic missile program or some of Iran's regional adventurism?
Looking to the future of the new administration, do you find that there's potential for collaboration between Iran and the United States, or do you see more conflict?
No, I do think it's possible to have some cooperation. I do want to dampen the optimism that some diplomats have in the United States that this can lead to bigger and better things simply because I don't think it's going to change the Supreme Leader's mind. I don't think it's going to change the minds of some of the most ideological, hardcore members of the Revolutionary Guard either. But that said, they can compartmentalize. Traditionally, Afghanistan has been one place where we've had this sort of cooperation before, even though the Iranians have played both sides of that conflict. As we talk about let's face it, Pakistan's also, even though it's not designated, in effect, it's a state sponsor of terrorism. And Afghanistan is landlocked. One of the problems we have with Afghanistan and supplying Afghanistan is it empowers Pakistan because that's been our main logistical means to get into Afghanistan. I would suspect that the Biden administration might start working with the Iranians with regard to Chabahar, which, if you look at the map, it's on the north. It's on what the Iranians call the Makran coast, the northern Indian Ocean, not too far from Pakistan itself, but the Chinese, perhaps the Indians as well, the Iranians are building rail connections into Afghanistan. It's a much shorter distance. It's only about 400 miles into Afghanistan from there to the nearest border, I guess the Milak border post. And so that's one area where I would see cooperation. And then another area where I could see potential cooperation is Armenia, especially in the aftermath of the Nagorno-Karabakh deal. The Iranians have always had strong cultural ties with Armenia, even though Armenia is Christian, Azerbaijan's Shiite, Muslim, 12 are Shiite as well. But when I lived, the first time I lived in Iran during the Rafsanjani era, I lived in Jolfa, in Isfahan, which is an Armenian neighborhood. The Iranians have maintained those ties with Armenia. Of course, the United States has a great deal of interest domestically in Armenia. And so, especially with the most recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, there certainly is, there's room for cooperation there as well. And then, honestly, we do cooperate inside Iraq. It's understood that both the Americans and the Iranians, it's understood, but not publicly stated, that both the Americans and the Iranians have veto power over certain key positions inside Baghdad. The Iranians didn't want someone like Adnan Zorfi, who had fought hard against as governor of Nejaf against some of the Iranian-backed militias. The Americans don't want Hadi Amri, who is the head of the Badr Corps, And so we're compromised on someone like Mustafa Kadhimi, who's the current prime minister. So you have that sort of cooperation as well.
In your book, Dancing with the Devil, you criticize past American efforts to negotiate with Iran, partially because Iranian leaders constantly renege on agreements. Was the Trump administration right to pull out of the nuclear deal, in your opinion? And subsequently, would you apply the same criticism to Biden's pledge to rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal?
I guess the root of my criticism with regard to some of our negotiations is that we're simply negotiating with the wrong party. And we can go back to other areas outside of Iran with regard to this. When, with regard to some of the negotiations with the Palestinians, one of the problems we always had was who actually controlled some of the groups and whether we were talking to the right people. Likewise, when it came to the British outreach to Muammar Gaddafi, it took about, or that ultimately led to the US outreach with Muammar Gaddafi, it took about 3 years of behind the scenes work just to ensure that the Libyans with whom we were dealing, or in this case, the British were dealing, could actually deliver Gaddafi. And we've had lots of situations going back to, for example, 2003 in the run up to the Iraq war, where Kamal Kharazi, the Iranian foreign minister at the time, and Mohammad Javad Zarif, who is now the foreign minister, but at the time was the UN ambassador, had promised that the Iranians wouldn't introduce, for example, security forces, Badr Corps and Revolutionary Guard and so forth, into Iraq. And by the admission of Iranian journalists, almost as soon as the Iraq war began, they entered Iraq. So then the question becomes either did Mohammad Javad Zarif lie, or was he sincere, but the Revolutionary Guard simply didn't listen to him? So the question then becomes, if the Revolutionary Guard are the ones who are in charge, are we negotiating with the right people? Does the foreign minister have any say over the security apparatus? And the answer to that's no. So, I mean, fundamentally, problem one is, are we negotiating with the right people? Problem two, when it comes to some of the concessions, is there's something in Iran called, Khatam al-Anbiya, which is basically the economic wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And by some estimates, they control up to 40% of the Iranian economy. Now, if your theory is you're reaching out to the reformists, you're going to push investment into Iran, and that's going to bolster the fortunes of the reformist camp or ordinary Iranians, is that actually true? Or are the people who are going to get contracts from the French coming in, the Germans coming in, and everyone else, is that going to pump money directly into the hands of the hardliners in a way which undercuts the very security we're trying to achieve? I would apply, I have criticism with regards to Biden's pledge to rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal, just because I don't think it's going to be all that possible since the deal has moved on. And regardless, what I would see happening is negotiating with Iran. I mean, the Iranian negotiators are very, very adept and very sophisticated in their reading of American politics. Sometimes the process is more valuable than the final agreement. And with Biden's longevity in question, at the very least, I would expect the Iranians to drag out the negotiations as long as possible during the Biden administration, and then make a calculation about whether it's better to be locked into a deal then, or whether, for example, they could get a better deal from a Harris administration. And they're going to play that game. So nothing is going to be easy for the Biden team. And if they think they can just go back to the status quo ante, they're wrong.
How have US-led sanctions changed the nature of Iran's position in the world? And do you believe they are effective?
First of all, I think the thing that most undermines Iran's economy isn't sanctions. It's actually the lack of commercial law and the distortive effect of the Revolutionary Guard, which stands above the law. I mean, basically, commercial contracts in Iran are largely meaningless as the Revolutionary Guard throws its weight around. Under the Shah, there's a great deal of investment in the military. The same way that Saudi Arabia invests now with high ticket items at the time. I mean, Saudi Arabia might want to get its hands on the F-35. At the time, the Shah was all into the F-14 fighter, different generation. But as soon as the revolution happened and Iran was isolated, the Islamic Republic was isolated, they couldn't get spare parts, aside from then the Reagan administration arms for hostages. They couldn't, for the most part, get spare parts. They couldn't, a lot of their high profile items, they simply couldn't fly, couldn't get into service and so forth. And so they made a strategic decision, which the supreme leader and the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps still talk about, which was to build up their indigenous military capacity so they would never again be dependent on foreign powers. So it's changed the nature of Iran's economy in that way, in terms of their emphasis on domestic supply chains, that sort of issue. But beyond that, one of the issues which this has exposed, and this continues to expose, is this whole issue of unilateral sanctions on the part of the US, which can frustrate a lot of the international community, but they do remain effective. And remember, it wasn't Trump that started the unilateral sanctions with regard to Iran. It was Bill Clinton. If you go back to his executive orders back in 1994 and 1995, that's where we started getting extraterritorial sanctions, including on European companies, on those transshipping. And then you had in 1996 the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which did the same thing, and you had bipartisan support. But once Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo started imposing unilateral sanctions, I mean, living in a think tank, I talk to Iranians from time to time. At the same time, I'll talk to European business leaders, including folks coming through Washington who are the CEOs of their companies. I mean, companies whose names you know. And what they will say is they absolutely despise the American unilateral sanctions, but they'd be crazy not to abide by them. Because even if Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, or Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, will tell their business people that they oppose unilateral sanctions and to ignore the Americans, business leaders are accountable not to their politicians, but to their stockholders. And so they don't want to take the risk of multi-billion-dollar penalties. And therefore, we saw this back in the mid-1990s. We saw this now, that unilateral sanctions are effective. But what all too often the backslappers and the cheerleaders, especially in more conservative circles in Washington, forget is it does have a corrosive effect on broader American diplomacy, and then how we quantify that in terms of our broader relations with Europe and so forth. That's something which hasn't been determined, or at the very least, there's not consensus about.
Thanks for listening. Find us on Instagram and Facebook, and stay tuned for events like this one in the future.